I have the pleasure now of introducing. He may have changed his speech now. I've heard our guest speaker give some recorded and non-recorded comments, and there might be a. I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, someone who is no stranger to Flint Rotary, no stranger to our community, our Congressman Dan Kildee. Congressman Kildee is someone who has served the people of Flint and Genesee County for most of his adult life, I think, just about all. Having served in the private sector, having served, of course, many times in the public sector, at the local level, at the county level, and then, of course, now as our member of Congress representing the 5th District of Michigan. He serves and has been in that office since he was first elected in 2012, serves on the Ways and Means Committee, I believe is still, right? Ways and Means, which is code in Washington for the checkbook committee. So that's a good committee to be on. And we're grateful to have him. He's joined today by Jake, who is a longtime aide to the Kildee family and someone who's enjoyed sitting next to Raphael, I'm sure, swapping old stories from working for the other Congressman Kildee. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome our Congressman, Dan Kildee.
Thanks, Kyle, for that introduction and for the invitation to be here. What I thought I would do is just take a few minutes to touch on some of the work that I've been focused on in Washington, address briefly the situation in Ukraine. I'll learn more next week when I get a classified briefing. And I know this is weighing on everyone's hearts, but most especially Marie, with whom I've talked about Ukraine for I don't know how many years. And this is a moment that we all dreaded. We'll touch on that briefly. But I first just want to make a couple of mentions. Jim mentioned Harriet Kenworthy. You know, our community has been enriched by so many people who gave selflessly to better the lives of people they would never meet. And that is, to me, the way I would think of Harriet. She and I served together on the Community Mental Health Board, but I don't remember a time that I didn't know her. And I don't remember a time that I didn't know her to be doing something to make life better for people that she would never meet. And to me, that's the ultimate measure of an individual's contribution. So hopefully we take a lesson from her life, try to emulate what she did for so many. And of course, you know, we recently, some of you I saw at the funeral of Woodrow Stanley, a person that I've known, again, for a very long time. It's always sad to see these changes and to see people pass from our community and pass from our lives who were so meaningful in them. And the last one I'll mention is a person who I'm very much associated with, and so is Rotary. And that is my Uncle Dale, who passed away just last fall. I mention Rotary because I'm sure most of you know that the trajectory of his life was very much affected by an investment that Rotary Club International Foundation made in his future by awarding him a Rotary Foundation fellowship to study Islamic history in Pakistan. He spent a year there, and then, interestingly enough, on the way home, went to Russia and met with Boris Pasternak, who some of you may know, who was a writer and also a dissident there. It shaped his view, his worldview, that experience. And I believe, and he told me this many times before he passed on, that that experience is what motivated him to transition from teaching to a life in public service. And it was because Rotary saw in him a spark that you were willing to invest in. So on behalf of my family, the legacy of my Uncle Dale, I just want to again say thank you to everything Rotary does, but particularly for the impact that you had on his and by extension on my life. So thank you for that. I'll briefly touch on a few of the points that are sort of front of mind, and this is mostly the work I'm focused on. I'll be happy to take questions on any subject. The most significant accomplishment, say in the last year, is something that we've been talking about doing for a long time, and that is finally investing in America's infrastructure. The bipartisan infrastructure law, all three of those words are important. It's a law. It's not just an idea. Finally got it done. It deals with infrastructure. It was formulated in a bipartisan fashion. And to me, all three of those aspects are important. Now it's up to us to implement. And we are focusing a lot of our attention on that. And my particular focus is ensuring that as we implement this legislation, that the unique needs of communities such as the one that we're in, with older infrastructure, with more constrained capacity at the local government level, have those particular unique needs recognized. And I've been speaking with the folks at the White House who are implementing this and getting some traction in helping them understand we need to overinvest in the places that have had underinvestment for too long to get us back to the same starting line that everybody else is at. The notion that a rising tide raises all ships assumes that we're all sitting in the same place when the tide comes up, but we're not. So I'm really focusing a lot of my energy on that. This will invest in roads and bridges, rail and ports, the hard infrastructure that we know is traditionally defined as infrastructure, but it goes beyond that as well. Investing in drinking water, we know the need for that. Flint was not an anomaly. Flint was a warning to the rest of the country. And in some ways, that warning was heard and is manifest in the fact that there's a substantial amount of money for the first time in water system investment in the infrastructure legislation. If we had done this a decade or two ago, perhaps some of what we experienced could have been avoided. We're also investing in 21st century infrastructure. The pandemic, in many ways, obviously tragic as it is and was, still is, it also revealed some weaknesses in our society, in our economy that we need to address. And one of those real weaknesses that the infrastructure legislation is intending to address is the lack of reliable access to affordable broadband internet. I say affordable as well, because in rural communities and in some pockets within the urban environment, during the pandemic, when just taking two examples, when access to educational services during the shutdown and access to telemedicine, when we were expanding the ability for people to get healthcare through telemedicine, those were great advances, except if you didn't have access to internet. And it sort of revealed in more stark fashion the weaknesses in that aspect of what is now essentially infrastructure as important as a road or a bridge or a water line. You can't access the economy. A small business can barely operate without reliable access to the internet. And so this initiative will bring many, many millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to Michigan and billions across the country to make that investment, to make sure that we're all connected and all have equal access to the economy and equal access to other aspects of life that are critical and important. One of the pieces that I've been working on, again, I'm focusing more on the work that I've been doing because I helped write the much of the infrastructure bill, but in particular, investing in the 21st century by making sure that as mobility, transportation moves toward electric vehicles, which is the future. It's a question of how fast this will occur. It clearly is the future. Industry understands it. They're making the investments. We have to match the investments on the industry side with some sort of priming of the pump with public investment in charging infrastructure. Now, I think ultimately what we want to see is the private sector take that and run with it. But while it is still in this time difficult to justify that investment because the return is so distant, it makes sense for the public sector to fill that gap until we have scale that justifies the kind of private investment that will make sense. It's clear that it's good for the planet. It's clear that ultimately it's going to be good for the economy. The real challenge for us, and when I say us, I mean us here, is to make sure that we own that future. Because there is a great risk, absent substantial investment in electric vehicle and the electric vehicle transition with robust consumer credits, business credits, tax credits to incentivize the use of electric vehicles, particularly in fleets where it's more efficient at this point in time anyway. It's possible that we miss the lessons of, say, the early 1970s, when we failed to heed the warning in the marketplace about the demand for more fuel-efficient vehicles and lost market share as a result. And I'm talking about domestic manufacturers. We can't allow China in particular to own electric vehicle production. Right now, more than half of the electric vehicles sold are produced there. We want electric vehicles produced in the vehicle city and in the motor city. We want them done here. And it's going to take some investment to do that. So I've been working very closely with the leadership, particularly at GM, but also Ford and Stellantis, which is now what we call Chrysler, to try to align the incentives so that we can own our own future and see that investment take place here. And of course, GM is responding. We just saw substantial investment in battery production and in electric vehicle production announced by General Motors, and that's a step in the right direction. What we don't want to see happen is that we end up in the US, and particularly in this part of the country, becoming consigned to the consumer side of this transition. We want to be on the production side of it. It'll take fewer people to produce an electric vehicle, but I'd rather have that than no one producing electric vehicles here. Another piece of the economy that was laid bare as a result of the, this terrible pandemic is issues around supply chain. And just a couple of years ago, the term supply chain was not exactly, in the American lexicon. People who study these things understood it, but unless you're in manufacturing, supply chain is just sort of a concept. We now know what it means. And we know what happens when we lose control of our own condition, our own situation. We have become so focused on embracing the lowest cost alternative when it comes to supply for manufacturing, for example, that we put ourselves in a position that our security is at risk. So what we need to do is find some reasonable balance. I'm not suggesting a protectionist sort of approach, because I think that's dangerous itself, but a more thoughtful, moderate approach would have us invest in reshoring critical elements of the supply chain so that there's redundancy in that supply chain, and particularly, like, just thinking about one aspect, microchips, the ability to have domestic production and support our own manufacturers is really in our own national security interest and our economic security interest to do so. So again, it's a matter of aligning the incentives, whether it's through the tax code, through infrastructure investment, the pieces where we can have and will have an impact one way or the other, need to be focused on reshoring a significant aspect of the supply chain that supports our manufacturers, supports our growers, and allows us to have an element of control over our own future without being put at risk. I mean, of course, without getting too far into it, what's happening right now with Russia and Europe is another good example of not being able to control one's own future. Europe is overly dependent on Russia for natural gas and coal, and we're now in a position where we really need to think about redundancies in their ability to access energy in order to deal effectively with this bad actor in Moscow. It's hard to talk about the economy without dealing with inflation. One of the things we obviously have to accept is that unless we can make these investments in our own domestic supply chain, we put ourselves at some risk. Like, for example, of the inflationary pressure that we're facing right now, most economists believe about a third of that is attributable to what's going on in the auto sector. What's happening in the auto sector is directly attributable to a supply chain interruption of an essential element that, had it been domestically produced, we would have been able to continue to maintain the supply to the demand for autos. Right now, there's high demand, supplies at a choke point. When anybody who's studied fundamental price theory understands if you have limited supply for something which is in high demand, there's inflationary pressure that's going to hit, and we're seeing that now. So this is not disconnected, even though the pandemic and the effect it's had on supply chain is the principal driver of inflation. It's not disconnected with the fact that for decades, we have not invested in our own domestic supply infrastructure, and we need to make sure we do that. Of course, gas prices is one of the ways people are feeling it. It's not going to solve the problem, but I have introduced legislation to temporarily pause the federal gas tax to get at least that some relief for consumers and businesses, because we have such an investment right now in infrastructure as it is, because of the bipartisan infrastructure law that we passed. It gives us a little space that we ought to pass on to consumers who are really feeling the pressure right now. So I don't suggest suspending it forever, but say suspend it until the end of the year is what our legislation would do, would provide a modicum of relief at the pump, which I think is really important. And we can do it really without compromising what the gas tax typically funds, and that's investment in infrastructure. We've got $1 trillion we're putting into infrastructure. We can afford for the next several months to lose the 28 billion or so that we would generate from the gas tax and pass that savings on to consumers at a time when they really need it. Last couple things. The environment in Washington is not great. Frankly, I think if we had more people from the Midwest there, we'd be a whole lot better off. Because what I find is that folks from our part of the country, while we all have really strong views about stuff, I do, for sure, we bring a different approach to the conversation than some do. We're supposed to have disagreement. We're talking about this when we're getting our lunch. We're supposed to have disagreement in our government. It is not a sign of dysfunction. It's actually the highest form of functionality in our government when we have people who disagree, because the framers, tall and short, all created a system that forced people from different perspectives to the same table. But that's not where it ends. When you get to the table, you have to come to the table with goodwill. And what I'm trying to do right now, the issues come and go. Issues come and go. What I'm trying to do is to bring that sensibility, that notion, which I learned really mostly in local government here. You got to work things out. You can't treat your opponent like an enemy. And there are people that I think I'm well justified to be really angry with right now. I had a bad experience about a year ago in the Capitol. Yeah, I'm still angry about that. I got trapped in the gallery during that attack. But if I carry that anger around with me forever, that anger becomes poison. And all I'm going to do is deliver that anger to somebody else. So I don't know, this isn't an issue. It's just something that I feel is really important for me to say, that just want you to know what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to put that anger aside and reach across the aisle, and with people I disagree with, even people I disagree with on the subject that was the precondition to that attack, You gotta be able to talk to them. And I'm trying to do that. I also think it's important, and this is a bit of a criticism of my own party, that we try to legislate in a way that people can absorb. And that's why what I've suggested, like picking one example, we have this big agenda, which, I support most of the stuff that's in it. It's just hard to describe what it is, and it's hard for people to consume when it's a long laundry list. So what I've suggested, and I'm now beginning to initiate, is let's do this stuff one at a time. Let's take it one piece at a time so people can understand it and absorb it, think about it. And so, like, for example, I'm introducing legislation just now, cap the out-of-pocket price of insulin at $35 a month. Part of what we're trying to do with this big agenda is deal with drug pricing. Let's take this thing one at a time. Everyone knows someone who's diabetic. I happen to have a daughter who's diabetic, and she's dependent on insulin. Of course, she's also got mom and dad. So when a third of her wages were going to the cost of being a diabetic, mom and dad stepped in. But not everybody has mom and dad. So our legislation, rather than being part of a broad, sweeping, almost incomprehensible piece of legislation, do it one at a time in an orderly fashion so that people know what we're doing and can understand it. And I'm starting with insulin because everybody understands insulin's 100 years old. No one should have to ration insulin in the wealthiest country in the world at the wealthiest moment in its history in order to stay alive. And I know too many people, I've talked to too many people that have had to make the choice between using their insulin to stay healthy and prolonging their life to its natural course, keeping the heat and the lights on or the food on the table. I mean, we just can't be that. And we can afford it. And it's just a matter of policy. So I'm going to pursue that. That's just one example. You'll see others. Finally, Ukraine. And again, I think about Marie and what she and all Ukrainian Americans are going through. This is really a moment of truth. Vladimir Putin's a bad guy. I think we have every right to be angry at him. He has an aspiration to rebuild something, that his romantic obsession with rebuilding the Soviet Union is starting here. Ukrainian people have a right to determine their own future, just like every human being on earth does. And so I'm glad to see 27 nations now, and there will be more, banding together to take this on. I'm glad to see European leaders in particular. We're going to make a tough sacrifice by taking on Russia. We may have to make somewhat of a sacrifice as well, because the cascading impact of an economic crisis in Europe resulting from that attack, that invasion, could have an effect on us as well. Because particularly in energy, it's a global market, and it could have an impact on us. But it's going to have a dramatic impact on Europe. They understand it's worth the risk. If anyone understands, particularly looking at the history of the 20th century, Europeans understand we're better off dealing with this now in as tough a way as we can, even if there's pain associated with it, to stop these dominoes from falling. And it starts with Ukraine. So I'm supportive of, I had a briefing last night, but it was on the phone, so it wasn't a classified briefing. So basically it's like them reading me the news. Next week I'll have a classified briefing and I'll know a whole lot more about where we're going with this. But I support the notion of a very robust, just as debilitating a set of economic sanctions on Russia as we can come up with. The sanctions that have been introduced so far will cut about 80% of their access to their bank assets off, and we can go further than that. We also, I think, need to think very, very carefully about the trading partnerships, particularly in Europe, that we may want to have impacted. Russia's economy is smaller than the size of the economy of the state of California. We need to bring, Putin back to reality, and bring them to their knees, and cut off their economic ability to pursue these aspirations. And I hope that we're successful with that, because the last thing we want to see, and the thing I don't think we ever will see, would be American troops facing off against Russian troops. That's World War III. We can't afford that. American people won't support it. Neither would I. So why don't I stop there? I'd love to, I don't know how much time we have, but I'd love to take comments or questions. Maybe I can get the ring to go.
Thank you, Congressman. We will take questions. Just a reminder for Rotarians in the room, after you ask your question, I'm going to repeat it so the folks on Zoom can hear it, and then we'll hear from the Congressman. I see Joe Fike with the hand first, followed by on Zoom, and then Michael Thorpe, and then Dan. Joe? The question was, will the Ukraine situation be a prolonged war or relatively short-lived?
First of all, I thought I was done answering questions from Joel Fike. Well, I'd like to say that I think it will be expedited, but knowing that we're taking the approach that economic sanctions are our principal tool, I think it will take longer than we would like it to, because it takes time. We've seen this before with Russia. I mean, it takes time for these sanctions to be fully realized. I think we're being more strategic about the sanctions that are being executed now, because we really are targeting those wealthy oligarchs, those billionaires that surround and empower Putin. And cutting off their access to their assets is really critical. But I'm afraid, and I wish I had a different answer, but I'm afraid that it will take some time.
Is there a question from Zoom? If so, unmute and go ahead.
Marie, this is Marie. Okay, Congressman, obviously I have a lot of feelings, and I talk to my cousin every morning, and I talked to her this morning, and of course she's in Lviv. My family's all in Lviv, which thank God it's at least safer than being in Kiev or farther east. In fact, one of my friends here in Flint just called because she's in depression and a nervous wreck because her family's in Kharkiv. And that's the one that's been bombed more than any place else in the east. Anyway, we talk about sanctions. Okay, then you talk about all of the Russians who basically own London. I mean, for all intents and purposes, London, England, that's where all of the oligarchs are. That's where all this money is. Is anybody going to put any pressure finally on England to get rid of them and to get rid of their kids and get rid of their money and their homes and all of that? That's number one. Secondly, my cousin brought this up this morning. I forgot all about this. She said when the invasion was in Georgia, that one of the things that happened, that quite a few of the presidents of different countries went to the Capitol, and that stopped Putin for coming into the Capitol. Now, I don't know if that would ever work again, because he's now even more out of his mind than he was then. But has there been anything at all thought of to do something like that, to get some high-level people into Kiev, so that he's not going to want to attack Kiev and kill world leaders? That's it. Otherwise, I'm back to crying about everybody.
Yeah, first of all, on the first point, I'll specifically raise that question when we get into the classified brief next week, and then maybe I'll share with you whatever I'm able to. But you make a good point, and I haven't been able to ask these questions in the unclassified setting because the sanction process is one that is in part only useful when there's a bit of an element of surprise involved in it, because assets are quite movable. The issue, particularly around foreign meaning non-Russian held assets, is a significant question. And we are debating right now, and we need our European partners to come along with us in targeting at least one other major aspect of the international banking system that is a little more complex. There's some technical issues, but we're getting closer on that. And I think that will allow us to basically follow the oligarchs and their resources wherever they are, with the idea of choking off their access to their own money. And if I have my way, the same way we did with Iran, those assets, once seized, will be used to pay the victims for the cost of this attack. If I have my way. That's what we did with Iran. And that's what I want to see us do with the assets that can be frozen and potentially through the ICC seized and taken and put into a trust that will pay the people of Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora for the losses that they're facing. On the second question of Putin, I mean, I don't know what, I have not seen much that shows me that he's capable of rational behavior, other than very rational, cold calculations. I mean, about pursuing his aspiration.
Yes.
And being willing to do anything, kill anyone in order to do it. I mean, it's more than irony, because it's more deadly than irony. But the thing that's difficult to accept is the ostensible explanation that he uses for this invasion, you know, somehow implies that people's rights are being compromised. Meanwhile, in Moscow, when you have thousands of Russians protesting, what is Putin's reaction? Jail them. He's a bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's a dangerous, dangerous person.
I think Michael J. presents.
Well, this is where you're going to hear me say something that you probably hear me say over and over again. The Senate is where good ideas go to die. So we have that legislation in our House Transportation Bill. We're going to have to run that again with the Transportation Improvement Plan, because the Senate, while they didn't take out one aspect of the community projects that we put in, which includes support for demolition of abandoned houses, support for training programs for people in nursing facilities that we put in, some work with the Sheriff's Department and the Prosecutor's Office to improve the justice system. The transportation designated projects were pulled out by the Senate. And I'm only half joking when I say the Senate is good ideas go to die. It's where all ideas go to die.
I think, Dan, you still have a question or no?
Yeah, well, you know.
So Dan's question was regarding Taiwan and China.
Yeah, I mean, China is, you know, is a different, but equally different in many ways, but equally ambitious nation that will use all its tools. And Taiwan is a very serious issue. I meet regularly with the Taiwanese leadership. There's a lot of anxiety there. The issue for us is whether we can use the economic tools we have to deal with China's bad behavior. I have been successful, at least in some aspects, in getting some of that done, partly through legislation. But right now, we need stronger laws on the books to allow the U.S. to challenge China's bad practices as leverage to keep them from aspirations like taking back Taiwan. That's the way they do business, and that's the way we're going to have to address them. The only other alternative, of course, is something that we don't even want to contemplate, and that is direct, physical interdiction if they attempt. But I think we need more leverage with China. This is really the issue. I mean, when it comes to China in particular. And I think that leverage comes from taking on their worst practices. One of the worst practices that the Chinese have used in order to compete and grow their economy at a rate faster than ours is they cheat when it comes to intellectual property. But even more egregious than that is that they exploit their own people. Like in the Xinjiang province, the Uyghur population, some of you may be familiar with, are sent to work camps. And the effect that it has is felt right here. Yes, was it yesterday or the day before? Yeah, day before. I visited a company in Hemlock, a really great company called Hemlock Semiconductor. They have had their products undercut by slave labor in Xinjiang province. So we pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed, and finally we were able to get what's called a WRO, a hold release order, on any products coming from the Xinjiang province that are polysilicon. And then we passed just recently the Uyghur Protection Bill that, when implemented, is going to give us another set of tools. I know this is a long answer to a really specific question, but the way I view it is that we haven't been either willing, able, or whatever. For some reason, we haven't been as tough in combating these practices that the Chinese Communist Party has been using to advance themselves. And some of it is more legitimate, like their Belt and Road Initiative, where they're really, reasonably legitimate, where they're investing in infrastructure across the globe and across China to modernize themselves. This is where I think we own the problem, in the sense that we haven't invested on our infrastructure. There have been years where China has spent 10 times what we are as a percentage of their GDP. That's not so much to your point. My point is, we need to toughen up in terms of the trade and economic tools, but particularly trade when it comes to China. So, number one, we deal with their bad practices, but more importantly, we have to have some kind of leverage with them when it comes to like their aspirations regarding Taiwan. And if the deal is they get to sell anything they want into the US or into the rest of the world, and we have limitations on what we can sell into their markets, all the leverage is on their side of the table. And it's going to take a little time. I hope we have enough time to save Taiwan for us to be able to use those points of leverage. This is being recorded, but this is where I had a lot of differences with President Trump. This is one of the areas where I was like, yeah, let's do this. Let's, like, the phase 1 agreement that he negotiated with China was a step toward that leverage. Problem is the Chinese haven't lived up to it. They're not buying the products that they promised to. So we really, this is I think fundamentally what we need to do is strengthen our hand with China by creating more anxiety among the Chinese Communist Party about whether they're going to have access to our markets, and use that as the soft power political tool that is effective and less lethal than the other tools that might be available.
Well, Jake gave me the sign, and I want to note that the congressman then talked for like 10 minutes of that answer after Jake said you got to go to your next spot.
One more.
I want to ask if you could close just with something that's, as you mentioned, HSC, something in the district as you're traveling that maybe has given you hope or optimism for this year or for maybe the rest of this decade. Just what's something that you've seen recently that gives you hope or optimism?
Well, I think there's a lot, honestly. I think about Flint because it's my hometown. And what I see when I see in the space of all of this trouble that we're facing, when I go and visit, for example, just as an example, the Ferris wheel downtown, and talk to these young, thoughtful entrepreneurs who want to plant their idea right here. That's exciting. I mean, I think we all know that the future depends on us commercializing great ideas. You know, that's how we built the country, and it's actually how our community was built, when just a handful of entrepreneurs who did have some resources available to them came together nearly by accident in 1908, formed a company that for a long time was the biggest company in the world. You know, there's nothing that says that some of these thoughtful entrepreneurs can't see that happen again. And so when I meet, especially with younger people who are motivated by desire to succeed and desire to invest, and that's what you see when you go visit some of those people coming in the front door at the Ferris wheel, to be one of the 100K ideas. There are others, but you asked me for one, and that's the one that really excites me. You see, and you know, we lost a great local entrepreneur in Oakland, Nixon. Some of you may have known Oakland. But he is a great example to me of a person just with an idea and the guts to try it out. And he built something that's really cool. And it's a legacy. Sad as it is that we lost him, it's a legacy that we can point to when we're talking to young people about them having some idea bouncing around inside their head or on notes in a backpack that, if given the proper opportunity, can be the next collection of those three people who met in the beginning of the 20th century and formed something really fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you to the Congressman. Thank you to Jake and to Chris and your staff for helping put this visit together. Really appreciate it. A donation to Rotary International Rotary Foundation will be made in your honor to support the eradication of polio from the world. I want to thank the following Rotarians for their service. Thank you, Joy Peterman, for your great inspirational message. Thank Rob Jewell for his support this entire month, coordinating all of our speaker visits. Thank you, Amy Krug, for your bulletin notes. Thank you, Elizabeth Cummins, for our setup and takedown. Elizabeth Jordan for Zoom host and for pushing record, which will help Amy with those bulletin notes. And thank you to Fred for our birthday announcements in 50-50. Please join us next Friday for a presentation by Carolyn Ross, who's going to have to drive a long way from work to get here. Kara, as many of you know, is the president and CEO here at the Food Bank of Eastern Michigan. She's going to talk about what the Food Bank has been doing to not only get through the pandemic, but then thinking about post-pandemic and their operations here at the Food Bank. And I will note for President-elect Elizabeth, to quote, paraphrase the late Fred Sanford, get ready, Elizabeth, it's coming, because I see March and June is quickly approaching. So Elizabeth, get ready. Yeah, the big one, right. So please join us next week. And as you are out and about this week and next week, please remember to serve to change lives. And we are adjourned.